what if, and just think about this for a second, what if the most famous miracles in human history were actually just high-level corporate boardroom meetings?
Oh, wow. That is a completely different way to frame it.
Right. I mean, what if we've been reading the story of Moses all wrong this entire time? Not as, a wizard with a magic staff confronting an evil king, but as a uniquely qualified CEO executing this meticulously planned hostile takeover against a corrupt, multi-generational monopoly.
Yeah, that completely upends how we interface with history. I mean, we have
Yeah.
this really deep-seated psychological habit of wrapping ancient events in mystical folklore. We want the burning bushes.
Oh, for sure. We love the drama.
Exactly. We want the booming voices from the sky, the magical parting of waters. It's a comfort mechanism. But when you apply a rigorous structural lens to these texts, all that magic just evaporates.
It totally disappears.
It does. And what you're left with is an absolute masterclass in organizational physics and socio-political engineering.
And that paradigm shift is exactly what we are plunging into today. So, welcome to the deep dive. You, the listener, are stepping right into the co-pilot seat with us as we unpack a remarkably dense, aggressively rational stack of source material today.
It really is dense.
It is. We are looking at the meticulous notes and transcripts from the Tolui Islam Digital Audio Lecture 713. Specifically, we are navigating their architectural analysis of Surah Maryam, Ayat 51 through 54.
And, our mandate for this session is absolute fidelity to the source's methodology. We are completely stripping away the centuries of supernatural theater, the theological bedtime stories, the cinematic grandeur, all of it.
No Charlton Heston today.
Exactly, no Hollywood special effects. This text, according to the Tolui Islam paradigm, is not a mystical travelogue. It is an advanced manual on leadership mechanics, strategic containment, and structural legacy.
Which means we really have to actively rewire how we visualize these narratives as we go. So let's tackle the biggest visual right out of the gate, the transition in the text to the story of Moses.
Okay, let's do it.
I want to set the scene exactly how we've all been conditioned to picture it since childhood. Mount Sinai, it's dramatic, it's treacherous. Moses is hiking up this jagged rock face, lightning is striking, clouds are swirling everywhere.
The whole dramatic package.
Right, and he supposedly has this literal, audio-based conversation with the divine on a geological peak.
Yeah, the traditional translation gives you a map, a mountain, and a loudspeaker. But the source immediately dismisses that imagery as just scientifically hollow.
Scientifically hollow. I love that phrasing.
It is because the Quran, in this analytical framework, has zero interest in special effects or geographical trivia. It is entirely focused on systemic operations. So we have to decode the vocabulary of the text itself.
Okay, where do we start?
Let's look at the two key terms here. The mount, which is Ur, and the right side, which is Iman.
Let's break those down. Because if I read calling from the right side of the mount, my brain immediately constructs a physical space. I'm picturing a guy standing on the eastern slope of a hill listening to a voice. How does the source strip the geography out of that?
By returning to the foundational structural roots of the Arabic words. Ascending the Ur is not about altitude. In this paradigm, Urdu represents the absolute peak of legal stability and strategic security.
So it's not a mountain.
No, think of it less as a rocky mountain and more as an unassailable strategic vantage point. Moses isn't climbing rocks. He is ascending to a level of intellectual and operational clarity, where the laws of the system are perfectly visible and structurally sound.
Okay, that changes the geometry of the text entirely. It's a positional peak, a state of being, not a geological formation on a map somewhere. What about Amen then? Because translating it merely as the right side feels like a directional coordinate, like take a left at the burning bush.
Which is exactly the trap people fall into. Amen shares a root with concepts of security, blessings, and operational stability. It's not right as opposed to left.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it represents an environment or a state of absolute safety and uncompromised integrity. So when the text describes Moses at the Ur on the Amen side, it is giving us a systemic description. It's an executive leader reaching a perfectly secure, uncompromised strategic vantage point to receive a massive influx of data.
That makes so much more sense in this context, but that brings up a massive mechanical question for me. The text uses the term Najia to describe what happens at this peak.
Right, Najia.
Traditionally, that's translated as a private conversation or like a whispered chat. If we are completely removing the physical booming voice of God from this scenario, how does this data transfer actually happen? I mean, is Moses just sitting there at a deep meditation? Is it just a moment of profound personal clarity?
It is far more rigorous than mere meditation. This is where the corporate and political science analogy becomes incredibly precise. Nagia implies the ultimate confidential counsel. According to the source, Naji is the equivalent of a highly classified boardroom briefing.
So less of a whispered secret and more of a strategic download.
Exactly. It is the exact pivotal moment an executive leader is brought into perfect intellectual synchronization with universal law. He is receiving the state's ideological constitution.
Wow.
And the source is explicit about the mechanics here, too. It is a direct data transfer to the intellect. It bypasses the need for physical sound waves, vocal cords, or acoustic echoes entirely. Universal laws do not require a PA system to be understood by a prepared mind.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it for anyone listening. We need to start picturing a wizard in a robe talking to a loud cloud and start picturing a CEO stepping into an ultra-secure, signal-blocked SCIF room, a sensitive compartmented information facility.
Yes, SCIF is a perfect analogy.
Right. He is stepping completely out of the operational noise of his environment to receive the core architectural blueprint for a civilizational turnaround.
And the reason he has to step out of that operational noise is because of the sheer density and purity of the blueprint he is receiving. If there is any interference, any pre-existing bias, the data transfer is corrupted.
It's like downloading a file on a bad connection.
Exactly. Which brings us to the specific qualifications of the man stepping into that boardroom. You can't just send anyone in there.
Right. Because you can't just pull anyone off the street and hand them a constitutional blueprint of this magnitude. The text gives us a fascinating linguistic deep dive into Moses' qualifications, starting with a very specific term, mukhla, or, as the text applies it to him, mukhlan.
Yes, Mukhlasan.
Now, I want to push back on this a bit, because in colloquial language, if I call a friend sincere or devoted, it's just a nice character reference. It means they mean well. And the traditional reading paints Moses as this deeply earnest, well-intentioned guy. But the source rejects that soft definition, doesn't it?
Completely. The source strips away that purely emotional, subjective layer. In the Tulu'i Islam paradigm, Mukhla operates almost as a scientific or metallurgical term. It literally means something that has been extracted and purified from contaminants. It means Moses was chemically pure.
Wait, chemically pure in a socio-political sense. How does that work, especially considering his background? I mean, he was literally raised in Pharaoh's palace. He grew up eating with the elite, being educated by their scholars, living inside the belly of the beast. How can the text possibly argue he had zero ideological contaminants when he was a product of that exact system?
That is the precise genius of his qualification. It is one thing to be pure because you grew up in isolation, totally ignorant of how the world works, but it is entirely different to be immersed in the most corrupt, sophisticated system on Earth, understand its mechanics intimately, and fundamentally reject its programming.
So he was basically inoculated.
Yes, his purity wasn't naivety. It was an active intellectual immunity. He observed the structural corruptions of the Egyptian elite, but he never absorbed them into his own operational code.
Okay, we need to spend some real time defining what that Egyptian elite actually was. Because the source doesn't just treat them as generic bad guys in chariots, right? It defines the Egyptian system as a meticulously engineered machinery of oppression, a trifecta of tyranny.
That's right. The source identifies three distinct, interlocking pillars that maintain this monopoly of power, and Moses had to be systematically isolated from all three. The first pillar is Pharaoh himself.
The guy at the top.
Right, who represents absolute political and executive oppression. He is the dictator, the ultimate bottleneck of power, who claims sovereignty over the physical lives and laws of the people.
He's the state apparatus. If Pharaoh says jump, you jump, or the military crushes you.
Exactly. But military force alone is expensive and unstable. You can't just oppress people physically forever. Eventually they rebel. The friction gets too high. That's where the second pillar comes in, Haman.
Ah, Haman. The priesthood.
The religious monopoly. Haman represents the ideological manipulation of the masses. The priesthood's job is to manufacture superstitious fear and theological justification for Pharaoh's rule.
So they provide the narrative.
Right. They convince the populace that Pharaoh isn't just a strong man, but a god, or at least chosen by the gods. They make the oppressed believe that their suffering is divinely ordained.
Which is brilliant and terrifying from a systems perspective. Haman gets the populace to police themselves.
Yeah.
You don't need a soldier on every corner if the people believe invisible gods are watching them on behalf of the state. It's so efficient.
It is the ultimate psychological containment strategy. And then you have the third pillar, Korun.
Okay, who is Korun?
Korun represents unchecked capitalist exploitation and wealth hoarding. He is the economic monopoly. He extracts the labor and resources of the masses, concentrating the wealth at the top to fund Pharaoh's military and Haman's temples.
So you have political tyranny, religious manipulation, and economic monopoly working in this closed loop. They all feed each other, and the text is arguing that to be mukhla, to be chemically pure, Moses had to be an uncompromising variable, totally untouched by this trifecta. He didn't owe Pharaoh a political favor. He saw right through Haman's superstitious theater, and he hadn't been bought off by Karun's wealth.
Exactly. If he had even a trace amount of those corruptions in his intellectual makeup, like if he harbored a secret desire for power or a subconscious fear of superstitions or greed for wealth, he could not receive the G.A.
Because the signal would get jammed.
Precisely. The constitutional blueprint would interact with his internal biases and produce a corrupted output. His Mukhlas status was the non-negotiable prerequisite for the download.
That sets up an incredible mechanical sequence. We have the pure asset. He steps into the secure boardroom, and he receives the uncorrupted data. Now, once that happens, the text uses two highly specific titles for him, Nabi and Rasul.
Right, both terms.
And again, looking at traditional translations, these are almost always lumped together as synonyms, right? A prophet is a messenger is a prophet. Why does the text insist on using both?
Because using them interchangeably is a massive analytical failure according to the source. The text is mathematically precise. It uses both terms because they describe a strict, non-negotiable input-output dynamic. Think of it as the two halves of a systemic engine.
Let's break down the mechanics of that engine. What exactly is the Nabi component?
So Nabi derives from a root meaning to receive high-level information or news. In this structural framework, Nabi represents the reception of knowledge. It is the input phase.
Okay, input.
It is that direct, unclouded acquisition of universal laws during the Naji briefing. When you are operating as a Nabi, your sole function is acquiring and comprehending the constitutional data.
You're the receiver, but, acquiring data doesn't change the world on its own.
Exactly, which is why the second component, Rasul, is mandatory. Rasul means one who is sent with a message or a mission. It represents the execution, the delivery, the operational output of that knowledge. You are taking the data you acquired as a Nabi and building the physical systems, the laws, and the society based on that blueprint.
So the causality only flows one way. You cannot possibly be a Rasul, you cannot output a constitutional framework if you haven't first been a Nabi and inputted the universal laws. You can't build a house if you haven't received the architectural blueprints.
Correct. But the source introduces a brutal critique here regarding the reverse scenario. Being a Nabi, receiving the profound, universal knowledge, is structurally meaningless, and even a violation of the system if you do not perform the duties of a Rasul and execute that knowledge in the physical world.
Oh, this is where the text goes on the offensive against mysticism and Sufism. This is a massive philosophical battleground in the source material. We need to unpack this concept of hidden knowledge, what mystics call kash or ilham.
Yeah, the source spends significant energy dismantling the mystic paradigm because it represents the ultimate breakdown of the input-output engine. The mystic, the Sufi, claims to receive direct, internal, spiritual knowledge from the divine, kash.
Right.
They claim to achieve this profound state of input, but what is their output?
Usually nothing. The critique is that they sit in a cave or a monastery or on a mountaintop somewhere, experience this incredible spiritual ecstasy, and then just marinate in it. They treat enlightenment as a private consumer good.
That's exactly it. They hoard it for personal indulgence. The source argues that this is fundamentally contrary to the entire paradigm of the Quran. The system requires action. The text actually brings in a brilliant quote from the philosopher Muhammad Iqbal to illustrate this exact friction.
Yes, that quote is a turning point in the analysis. Iqbal draws a razor-sharp line between the mystic and the prophet. He essentially says a mystic reaches the heavens, achieves this ultimate spiritual high, and doesn't want to return to the messy, painful physical world. They want to stay in the bliss.
Right, they escape.
But a prophet reaches the absolute highest intellectual peak, receives the unvarnished universal laws, and must return. They are structurally compelled to descend back into the chaos and inject that knowledge directly into the arteries of history.
They return to cause a systemic earthquake. It is a fundamental difference between personal escapism and structural revolution. The mystic is seeking a personal high. The prophet is executing a civilizational turnaround.
If we think about this in modern terms, for you, the listener, It's like a brilliant medical researcher inventing a flawless, miraculous cure for a devastating global disease. But instead of manufacturing it and distributing it to the hospitals, they lock the formula in a secure vault just so they can sit in their office and admire their own genius.
That's a great analogy.
They feel great about having the knowledge, but the patients are still dying out there. The Tolu-e-Islam framework rejects that entirely. Knowledge without operational output isn't just useless, it is institutional sabotage.
And that operational output demands immense, unrelenting discipline, which brings us perfectly to the next historical case study in the text. We move from Moses establishing the blueprint to the introduction of Ismaful, or Ishmael. And the focus here shifts heavily onto the output side of the equation, specifically the concept of reliability.
This is section 3 of our journey, the engine of reason and the tyranny of unproven assertions. So, the text introduces Ismail with a title that, on its face, seems almost too simple. That equal one white.
Right.
It translates to true to the promise. Now, if I read that casually, it sounds like getting the most reliable superlative in a high school yearbook.
Right.
It means he remembers his lunch dates and keeps his word. But knowing this source material, I know they aren't dealing in polite compliments.
Not at all. In the realm of socio-political engineering, being true to the promise is not a personality quirk. It is the absolute foundation of institutional predictability. Think about the stakes here. A revolutionary movement, a nascent society trying to build a civilizational turnaround cannot survive on vague, unproven emotional claims.
And it certainly cannot survive on the subjective charisma of a leader. Because charisma is a depreciating asset. It gets you the initial followers, it gets people excited at the rallies, but charisma doesn't manage a supply chain. Charisma doesn't ensure the courts are fair.
Precisely. A rationalist society demands data-driven reliability. Ismail is highlighted as Adik Awad because his operational output perfectly, mathematically matched his ideological input over an extended timeline. He didn't just have the knowledge, he executed it with ironclad consistency. He proved that a functioning system runs on unbreakable contracts, not whims.
Which requires us to slow down and really digest the philosophical tangent the source takes here. Because to explain why keeping a promise is so structurally vital, the text asks a massive question. What actually is a human being?
The source interacts with Western philosophy to build this argument. If you look at classical definitions, Aristotle defined man as a rational animal. Later thinkers defined us as tool-making animals, but the source highlights a much more rigorous definition. A human being is an entity capable of making a promise.
I want to linger on this because it feels counterintuitive at first. Why is making and keeping a promise the defining characteristic of a fully developed human intellect?
Because a promise represents a localized defeat of entropy. It is the concept of changelessness in change. Think about the nature of time and the physical universe. Time changes everything, right?
Yeah, constantly.
Our cells regenerate, our environment shifts, our moods fluctuate, our resources deplete. Chaos and change are the default states of the physical world.
So to make a promise today and to execute that exact promise a year or 5 years from now requires something inside you to resist all of that external and internal chaos.
Exactly. It means that your core self, what the philosopher Iqbal and the source refer to as Khudi, has achieved a state of perfect stability. It has remained permanent despite the passage of time. When you keep a promise, you are proving that your intellect and your will are stronger than environmental entropy.
That is such a profound concept. You are essentially telling the universe, the weather will change, the economy will change, my own emotional state will change, but my adherence to this specific contract will remain absolute.
It is the ultimate proof of a stable intellectual architecture. And this is why it is applied to Ismail with such reverence. Consider the source's view of the divine. God's universal laws, by definition, never change. They are the ultimate constant. Therefore, a human leader who claims to be fully synchronized with God, who has been in that non-G.A boardroom, must exhibit that exact same unbreakable predictability in the physical world.
So what this means for the listener and how we evaluate the systems we live under today is that keeping a promise is not just good manners. It is the literal metric of a developed intellect. If your leader, your CEO, or your politician operates on subjective whims, if they change their policies based on polling data or their mood or who bribed them last, they are structurally unstable.
Absolutely.
They are not Lukla, they are not synchronized with universal law.
An organization built on the whim of a charismatic leader will inevitably collapse under the weight of its own unpredictability. A rationalist society requires the baseline of Tadakalod absolute contractual reliability. Without that predictability, you cannot build the subsequent layers of society.
Which is the perfect bridge to those subsequent layers. We've examined the internal mechanics of the individual leader, the purity of the input, the necessity of the output, and the contractual reliability over time. But civilizational building is not a solo sport. Let's move into social physics and the law of requital in action.
This brings us back to Moses and the introduction of Haroon, Aaron, in verse 53, and then to the operational systems they were actually trying to build, summarized as Allah and G.A in verse 55.
Okay, let's start with the arrival of Aaron. We established that Moses steps out of the boardroom with the ultimate constitutional blueprint. He is chemically pure. But immediately after this intense briefing, verse 53 states that Moses is given his brother Aaron as a gift of mercy. Now, if I'm pushing back on the text here, why?
Why does he need help?
Right. If Moses is the ultimate pure asset with a direct download of universal law, why does he need a +1? Was he just lonely on the mountain? Did he need emotional support for the road trip back to confront Pharaoh?
Well, if we were reading this through the lens of a sentimental novel, perhaps. But applying organizational physics, the source explains Aaron's arrival through a strict mechanism called the law of requital.
The law of requital. Cause and effect operating on a systemic, almost macroeconomic level.
Yes. The system demands that every necessary component for operational success must be present. You have an executive leader, Moses. He has the purity and the blueprint, but he is facing a massive, entrenched institutional bottleneck. He has to dismantle the trifecta of tyranny, Pharaoh's military, Haman's propaganda, and Corinne's capital.
And historically, the text suggests Moses had a specific vulnerability. He had a communication bottleneck. He wasn't the most eloquent speaker. He had the pure data, but he lacked the bandwidth to broadcast it effectively against Haman's incredibly well-funded state media and religious propaganda machine.
Exactly. One man, no matter how pristine his input, cannot execute a structural shift of that magnitude against a monopoly single-handedly. The friction is just too great. The law of requital dictates that if an executive leader faces an institutional bottleneck in communication or delegation, the system must provide a complementary asset to balance the equation.
So Aaron isn't there because of nepotism? He's not the vice president just because he's the CEO's brother?
Not at all. Aaron is a systemic design feature. Moses provides the executive purity, the uncompromising adherence to the blueprint. Aaron provides the communicative power, the translation of that dense blueprint into public operational directives. It is the perfect corporate pairing, the visionary executive and the master communicator. The system automatically provides what the mission requires to succeed.
Okay, so you have the dynamic duo, you have the blueprint, you have the predictability, you have the executive and the communicator. But what are they actually doing? What is the physical output of this organization? Verse 55 states their goal is to establish two things, Allah and G.A.
And here, the source performs its most aggressive dismantling of traditional interpretation. If you survey the general public, they will define Allah as praying in a specific physical posture 5 times a day, and zakah as giving 2.5% of your idle savings to a charity once a year.
Right. Highly personal, private rituals. One is personal worship, the other is personal philanthropy. But the source argues that those definitions are woefully inadequate for the scale of what's happening here. I mean, you don't execute a hostile takeover of Pharaoh's empire, dismantle a religious monopoly, and rebuild a civilization just to get people to stretch on a rug and give away spare change.
It completely trivializes the text. In this advanced socio-political paradigm, Allah and Zakah are not individual rituals. They are the twin macroeconomic and macro-societal engines of a civilization.
I want to know exactly how these systems worked. What does Allah actually look like if it isn't just a personal prayer? Give me the mechanics.
So Allah is the engine of collective alignment. The root of the word deals with following closely, like a horse running perfectly in sync behind the lead horse in a race.
Oh, that's a great image.
Yeah, it is the structural organization of society. It is the mechanism by which every single individual, every institution, and every law in the community is synchronized with the universal laws that Moses received in the Najia.
Like a massive network of computers, all distributed, but every single one is perfectly synced to the exact same atomic clock. They're moving in perfect unison toward a strategic goal. It's the ultimate operational alignment.
Yes, it is a system of societal discipline, unity, and centralized focus. Without Allah, you basically have a mob. With Allah, you have a coordinated, unstoppable societal force. And then you have Zakah, which is the economic engine.
And how does Zakah function beyond just charity? Because charity implies giving your leftovers to the poor to feel good about yourself.
Zakah fundamentally rejects the charity model because charity relies on the whims of the rich. Zakah comes from a root word meaning growth, development, and purification. In this system, it represents a mandatory macroeconomic structure.
So it's built into the system itself.
Exactly. It is an economic system designed to ensure that resources continually circulate through the arteries of society. It acts as a structural preventative against the hoarding of wealth.
It's an anti-Haroon mechanism.
Precisely. It ensures that the surplus wealth of the society is aggressively reinvested into the base, nourishing the workforce, developing infrastructure, and eliminating poverty by design, not by pity. An economy running on zakah ensures that the society remains structurally sound and capable of growth, because a starving populace cannot maintain the alignment of Allah.
So when we synthesize this all together, Moses, Aaron, and Ismail didn't just preach moral platitudes. They weren't life coaches giving good advice. They were civilizational architects. They established a society aligned on universal laws through all and powered by an economy that intrinsically distributes wealth and nourishes its people through zakah.
And there is a vital, historically disruptive consequence to the structural design that the source emphasizes, particularly regarding Ismail's mission. By establishing an organization based entirely on ideological alignment, which is Allah, and operational contribution, zakah, they effectively shattered the deeply entrenched concept of lineage-based superiority.
This is a massive geopolitical point in the text. We have to address the historical obsession with Bani Israel, the children of Israel, and the pervasive idea that a group of people can be chosen by God simply because of their bloodline or their genetics.
The source is absolutely ruthless in dismantling that concept. Ismail's mission and the overarching framework of these verses was to construct a universal human brotherhood. A system built on universal, unchanging laws categorically rejects any ideology that divides humanity by bloodlines, race, tribe, or caste.
Because DNA is not an achievement. You can't be a Adikal Wade, true to the promise, capable of defeating entropy just because your great-grandfather was. Predictability, purity, and alignment have to be proven through operational output. They cannot be inherited through a genetic lottery.
Exactly. If the society runs on the engines of Allah and zakah, the only metric the system recognizes or rewards is your alignment with the ideology and your active contribution to the structural nourishment of the community. Biological lineage is an undeniable physical reality, but in terms of human value and systemic authority, it is rendered structurally irrelevant.
Wow. Think about how revolutionary that is. It completely democratizes human value based purely on alignment with universal law. It is a total repudiation of the concept of a chosen people based on race. It replaces a genetic monopoly with a strict ideological meritocracy.
It forces every individual and every generation to prove their worth to the system through their own output. No one gets a free pass because of their last name.
That is an incredibly empowering yet demanding framework. So whether we are looking at Ibrahim, Musa, or Ismail, we see that the blueprint for a rational, uncompromised civilization remains mathematically uniform. You must have the chemically pure input, the Musa and Nabi, the predictable execution, Adikal Wad and Rasul, the systemic teamwork, which is the law of requital with Aaron, and the dual engines of alignment and macroeconomic distribution, Allah and zakah. It's flawless. But, it begs a massive question about longevity.
It does.
What happens when we zoom out from these individual vanguards? How does a system like this survive the chaotic span of centuries? How does the text summarize this entire multi-generational chain of socio-political engineers?
That is precisely where the architecture reveals its true, terrifying scale. It builds up to an absolute crescendo of historical analysis. In Lecture 813, the source tackles Surah Maryam, Ayat 55, breaking down the ultimate structural synthesis of this lineage. We will explore the exact mechanisms the system uses to enforce multi-generational continuity and how a civilizational blueprint survives the test of centuries without degrading into mysticism. So see you in the next session.
I cannot wait to unpack that one. But before we wrap up today, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. We started this journey by deliberately stripping away the Hollywood special effects from our view of ancient history. We unplugged the magic. But I challenge you to apply that exact same ruthless structural lens to the present day. Look at the organizations, the companies, the governments, or the communities you are a part of right now. Are they running on the unpredictable whims of subjective charisma? Are they leaning on the fragile magic of good intentions? Or are they built on the absolute chemical purity, the data-driven predictability, and the structural alignment we just decoded? The blueprint for a stable, uncorrupted system hasn't changed. It has always been there, hiding in plain sight beneath layers of mythology. The real question is, looking around at the systems you participate in every day, who has the courage to actually build it?